In this lesson, we're going to get back into actually doing some stuff, and we're going to create those terrains, that foliage terrain and that grass terrain that we talked about the last two lectures. So let's go into Unity. And we have to make sure that we are level set here. And I did some things in here, and you guys may have done some things in here, but you should be back to this situation where things are clashing again. So maybe your OPCD meshes, remember we raised this up before by 0.25 so we could see it clearly while we were doing our some previous things. So let's put that back to 0. Okay, so it's clashing with our inner. We got that Z fighting going on. And then if you did any playing around with like the trees, if you had been following along with me, just make sure that in here, if the trees, make sure there's no trees. If there are, highlight them, click edit, remove trees. Same thing with the grasses. Let's get rid of any grasses that you have in there because we don't want anything planted on our main inner terrain. And then this cogwheel, let's make sure that the base terrain draw is on. Remember, if we turn it off, it becomes invisible. And let's make sure this time we're going to make sure that our tree and detail object, we're now going to turn that off because we do not ever want to plant on our inner terrain anymore. We want to plant on our foliage and our grasses. So let's turn that off. So quick edit here because I made some mistakes in the videos. You want to make sure that you have the right naming convention when you create terrains. So let me go through this quick. In this video, you see I named my terrain inner. That is slightly incorrect. When you have a main inner terrain, we must call it something like inner terrain. It must have the word, not work. It must have the word terrain in it, okay, that main terrain. So for example, we could just name it terrain. That's perfectly fine. If you name it inner, like I did in the video, that's a no-go. You're going to have some problems game side. You're not going to see it until you publish or you try to run your game inside GS Pro, because GS Pro is looking specifically for the word terrain in one terrain and in one terrain only. Okay. Another good example is if you name it inner and then parentheses terrain, that's perfectly fine as well because it has the word terrain in it. When you create your other trains, like your grasses train, which you'll do a little later, and your foliage train, which is later, and your outer, which you may or may not have, you cannot use the word terrain inside of them. For example, you cannot name your outer terrain. That's a no-go. That'll cause problems. Same thing. If you just name it outer, it's perfectly fine. Your foliage, just name it foliage, and it has to be called foliage. There's actually some scripts that don't call it leaves or trees, call it foliage. And then do not call it foliage terrain. All right. Back to your normally scheduled program. Now, let's go into our terrain backup folder, and you'll see in here that we've got our two height maps. We've got our inner and our outer. And we want to duplicate that inner. We want to make a copy of it. And we're going to use that copy. We're going to make two copies, actually. One's going to be for our foliage terrain. One's going to be for our grass terrain. All right. So if we highlight our inner, we come up here to edit, duplicate. Now it's going to make an exact copy of that. And then on that copy, so it added a 1 to it, we're going to rename it, and I'm just going to call this one foliage. Okay. And I'm also going to create another copy. So I'm going to highlight the inner again, edit, duplicate. And now I've got this one. I'm going to rename it, right click, rename, and I call this grasses. So now we have 3 height maps that are exactly the same. We've got inner, grasses, and foliage, and they are all the exact same. They have the exact same data associated with them. Okay. Now, if you remember before, how do we create a terrain out of these? Well, we need to drag them into our scene. So let's take foliage. Let's drag it into our scene and drop it. And you can see the name now becomes terrain. So now we've got 2 terrains out here. We've got our inner and another one called terrain. And we can see that we've got, for this terrain, we've got base draw on. And if we come over here, we can see that we've got the same textures that were there before. So we've got this texture, we've got the other things that we're using to draw with earlier. So let's come back over here to grasses, and let's move grasses over too. Well, now we got 2 terrains, the same name. How do we know which one's different? I should rename these, right? So let me click on this one. And if I come over here to this little brush and I go down, you can see here under the terrain collider that this is using the foliage height map, if I hit it, as its height map data. So I know that this one is foliage. So I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to rename it as foliage. And you can see if I go down to the next one, this one is linked back to grasses. All right. And we're going to rename this one grasses. So now we have 3 terrains and they're all visible. And we got all kinds of fighting going on here now. We got our inner that is showing. We've got our meshes, which are showing. We've got a foliage terrain, which is being drawn and showing. And we've got a grasses terrain, which is on, showing, and being drawn. Now, remember what we talked about in these other lessons. Inner, we're going to always show our inner because it'll get lowered under our meshes, but the outside here mesh is always going to be shown. So we're going to leave draw on, but we're going to make sure that tree and detail objects are disabled because we're never going to draw on the inner main terrain. Let's go down to foliage. Foliage, we should be turning it off because we do not want to draw it, right? We want it to be invisible, but we are going to draw our trees on it for now. We're going to draw our trees on it, but once we move them to game objects, we'll disable that. But we're going to leave it on now because we do want to plant trees on this layer. Same thing with grasses, right? We're going to turn draw off, and we're going to leave detail objects on. So now if we come back here to inner, if we turn this off, things should disappear and we should see nothing except for our meshes. Perfect. Okay, let's leave this off just so I can show you. Let's go to foliage. I'm going to turn foliage on, and now we have a terrain again, but it's our foliage terrain. We don't want to show that one. Let's leave it off, and grass is back on. Keep that in mind that at any given time, you can come back here and you can turn these on so you can see them, and it helps troubleshooting. If you're planting something and you're not exactly sure where it got planted or why it's on a different layer, you can always come back here and turn these draws on and off to give you a good idea of where your foliage and grass terrain's on. Okay, so let's go back. Let's turn our inner on. Again, draws off, foliage draws off, but tree and detail objects are on, and same thing with grasses. All set.